Let's give a little overview of Dante di Alighieri's The Inferno. My Italian is awful, but it should be better if I'm going to talk about The Inferno. The Inferno is the first part of a three-part trilogy called The Divine Comedy. And it was written between the years of 1314 and 1321. This is the 14th century. This is what we call the High Middle Ages. And it's important, really important, as a foundational piece of literature in the Western tradition because it's the first poem that was written in a language that people actually speak. Up until Dante, if you were writing poetry, you would write it in Latin. So, writing, poetry, written words were in a language that was a scholarly language. If you learned to write, you learned to write Latin. So, learning to read and write was really learning to read a different language than the one that you lived in. And this is why Dante is so important. Dante revolutionized the traditions of poetry because he was the first writer to write with seriousness and with art in a language that people actually spoke. Now, the word we use for this is a vernacular language. So Dante wrote in vernacular Italian, Italian that people spoke, and he might be called the first vernacular poet. Dante's also really hard for us. Dante is difficult for lots of reasons. We'll look at them closer. But I wanted to give you a heads up that this is not an easy read. We have a tiny little piece, just 100 lines from the 100 cantos that compose the whole Divine Comedy. And it's slow going. So give yourself time. You're trying to make sense of what's happening. Be patient with yourself. There's a lot of strange words, a lot of new words and names. Oh my goodness, all the names of people that very few of us have ever heard of. So just heads up, it's short, but it's a difficult text. And I guess the only other thing I want you to know before reading is that Dante's Commedia, the Divine Comedy in English, was a story about a voyage, quite specifically, like so the first buddy movie. Dante, the character, we call him Dante the Pilgrim. The character Dante meets a guy named Virgil, who turns out to be a very famous Latin poet. And the two of them go on a trip. They go on a trip on a tour, and instead of vacation in Florida, they go on a tour through hell. They go down and visit hell and all of its many different rooms, its different levels, its different stages. And then what happens after they visit hell, they run up and kind of magically, in a crazy way, get to another region of the afterlife called purgatory. Purgatory was a place where people were supposedly, sinners were able to work off their sins and work their way on up to the third volume of the trilogy called Il Paradiso, Paradise, which also had different levels and also had different people. So the whole Commedia is a tour, a trip through the afterlife, starting with hell, moving to purgatory, and then on up to paradise, at the very top of which is a wonderful representation of the Holy of Holies. So that's where we are now. Where we are in Canto 5, Dante and Virgil have gone through the very first limbo, and they've gotten to the second level of hell. The second hell, it's called the Terrace of the Lustful, or the Terrace of the Lust, where the lustful are punished. So with that in mind, it's very interesting to think about how are they being punished. Each of the stages in hell, each of the levels have a different climate. They have a different weather. They have a very specific torment, a punishment, and they have people who are guilty of that particular sin. So just remember as you're reading, these people are people who are damned. They've been sent to hell because of their very specific sin. And their punishment is a little bit different than we might have imagined. So be careful. There's a really easy to project our understandings of hell onto what Dante says, but in fact, look carefully. What's the temperature? What's the punishment? What kinds of nature do you see in this levels of hell? These are all really good questions to keep in your mind as you're working through it. So I'll see you in a half hour or an hour from now, where we can start talking about our 4 questions with Dante. Have a good read.